Truthspresso, episode 323.
In a world gone bonkers,
it is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started, and
where the culture is a dumpster fire,
we're coming for your children,
and churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truthspresso.
Truthspresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Hello there, friends, family, foes, and lurkers alike. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, for another exciting episode of Truthspresso. And this episode is a welcome departure from the Did Trump Really Say That series. It's a welcome departure from the usual politics that I've been doing recently. And of course, I can't help it with all the news going on with the election and the aftermath of the election. But hey, it's time to talk some theology. It's time to get back to the Bible. And actually, for the first time ever as a guest on Truthspresso, I have with me my twin brother, John. And so, John, welcome to Truthspresso.
Thanks for having me on.
And so there's a reason that John is with me here on this episode, because he came to my house so that we both could have a discussion with some guests that I had over. And these guests were Mormon missionaries. There were two elders from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's what they call their church. And they also brought their bishop along with them. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So a few weeks ago, two elders knocked on my door. It was a cold night, and it was kind of busy. Now I know I should be ready to talk with them at any time, but it just was not a good time. And so I figured it would be more fruitful to be able to talk with them when I didn't feel that I had to keep my kids orderly and my wife was busy and stuff. So I told them that I'd be welcome to talk with them in a few weeks. My family did get sick a few days later, and so we arranged a time where we could talk, and that time was Friday night, and that's the night that we're recording right now. And so, John, you have read all of the scriptures that the Mormons have put out, that Joseph Smith has written or claims to have translated. And would you like to talk a little bit about what is Mormonism? Feel free to give whatever you want to talk about as a background to that, given what you've read, and as kind of a precursor, what are we talking about? Who are these elders that visited our house and had a conversation with us?
Well, a while ago, I don't know if it was several years ago, I did buy their triplet, which is a bound set of Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price, which are the three standard works, I guess you'd call it, of Joseph Smith. Of course, if you had the quad, it would include the King James Version of the Bible with it, which makes it a really thick book, but I think the triplet is a lot easier to carry around. But I actually, when I came here, I brought that with me. I was intimidated of actually showing that I had that with me with the Mormons until they got to the Book of Mormon. I had my King James on top of my triplet, and once they referenced the Book of Mormon, I think it was in Alma, maybe chapter 7, and had us read from that, I took my King James off of my triplet so that I could reveal that I had it, and then I started following along with them. But I have read through the triplet once. I think it might have been back in 2017, so my memory is kind of shot with it. But with the Book of Mormon, I kind of have a basic understanding of the story, but there's a lot of details, and even some of the prophets, I can't remember their names, but in a quick summary of the Book of Mormon, it basically covers a nice rounded time, which is between 600 BC and 400 AD, so it's a 1,000-year story of a man named Lehi, supposedly, who was in Jerusalem, and he got called by God to leave Jerusalem around 600 BC and take his family with him. And two of his sons, one was named Nephi and the other was named Laman. And so they had to take their family out of Jerusalem before God destroys it and takes everyone captive.
So this is like right before the Babylonian captivity.
Yes, and then they were in the wilderness, but then they had to go back to Jerusalem to get these brass plates from a man named Laban, who was some kind of, if I can remember, he was wealthy and he was kind of dangerous, I guess, but Nephi had to kill him to get the brass plates, and they needed these brass plates to record their records, which would become the Book of Mormon. And supposedly a man named Mormon actually condensed it and might have reworded it. But anyways, it was probably, supposedly, according to the story, a lot more records, but they had to condense it. And that's why it's called the Book of Mormon. But Lehi, Nephi, and Laman and their families leave Jerusalem. They get these brass plates. They go back and get a man named Ishmael, his family, and they get some wives for the sons so that, of course, they can procreate and actually, continue their family lineage. But they reach a coast, and then Nephi gets a vision that he's supposed to build a ship and sail to some promised land, I would take it. And, of course, his brothers didn't like that, and they tried to stop him, but they end up sailing to Mesoamerica, the Americas, and they eventually, Laman, his descendants, become known as the Lamanites, which are supposedly the Native Americans that, like the descendants, or the Native Americans that are still in the United States are supposedly descendants of Laman, and then Nephi's descendants are known as the Nephites, and they're usually depicted as white-skinned, noble, Roman-like people in Roman, what do you call them? The
Tunics?
Tunics, yeah, like they kind of look like dignified, noble people. And then the Lamanites kind of depicted as like savages. And the Book of Mormon even talks about how when the Lamanites had rebelled against God, their skin had darkened. And it does use terms like white and delightsome when it talked about the Nephites. And trying to remember, there might have been somewhere in the middle of Alma where the Lamanites actually had a big revival, and there was a time where their skin became white and delightsome, but it didn't last. But of course, most of the story actually, because the descendants are in Mesoamerica, they have to get visions about when Jesus came to earth, when he died on the cross and rose again. And then supposedly, was it 3rd Nephi, I think? It was when Jesus visited.
So, yeah.
Jesus visits the Nephites in Mesoamerica after his resurrection and hangs out with them a couple days, heals people, like makes some blind people see and some deaf people hear, and has like a communion with them. And
as he teaches them the correct way to baptize in his name and stuff. And then he also teaches basically the whole Sermon on the Mount and some other teachings there, right?
Yeah. It's been a while since I've read this, but then I think toward the end of this story, there's a man named Moroni who actually has the brass plates with all the records on it, and there was a big battle between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and the Lamanites were destroying the Nephites, and they pretty much destroyed all of them except for this man named Moroni, and he hid these brass plates in some kind of, I guess, square-shaped hole somewhere in what state in the U.S.?
New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, somewhere around there.
And then, of course, he hides these brass plates, but somehow they survive until a man named Joseph Smith supposedly had uncovered the brass plates, and Moroni, as an angel, had visited him and told him about these brass plates and where he can find them. So Joseph Smith uncovers them. He translates the Book of Mormon into English, and it happens to sound like King James style English. And then, conveniently, he gives these brass plates back to Moroni, and Moroni takes them up into heaven, so we don't have the brass plates anymore, so we can't verify the original documents and whether he translated them correctly.
But we do have the translation, right?
Yes, we do have the English
alleged translation.
and that's all that matters.
The alleged yeah. And so the translation, of course, is the Book of Mormon. Yeah, and that was, in 1830, I believe, when it was published.
Yeah.
And wasn't Joseph Smith claiming that he translated the Book of Mormon, that the brass plates were written in Reformed Egyptian?
Yes, and I don't really know why it's called Reformed Egyptian, but I've heard theories that maybe the Mormons had to have some way of distinguishing it from real Egyptian to make sure that you can't debunk it. So it's Egyptian, but it's called Reformed, so it's different than the Egyptian we know of, so that we can't really verify that it's genuine Egyptian. But of course, we don't have the plates anyways.
So we're left wondering, those who are not of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the church Joseph Smith founded, based on his teachings and the idea that he had restored what was lost, like supposedly if maybe a few generations after the apostles, there was a great apostasy, and the church basically lost the plain and precious truths of the gospel. There's a lot of information about the truth of the gospel that was lost. And so Joseph Smith supposedly recovered it, but through these records, through these brass or golden plates. But we don't have those plates, so those of us who are not members of that church are left to speculate, did he even have gold plates, or did he make them and get rid of them, or whatever. But according to the story, yes, he had these plates, and then he returned them to the angel Moroni, and so we can't verify his translation, but we have the claimed end product, which is the Book of Mormon. And thanks, John, for summarizing what the Book of Mormon is about. And
of course, there's a lot of story in there that I'm not really covering, but that's just the broad summary of the beginning and kind of the end, and then there's a lot of filler in there, like these different prophets come to the Nephites and Lamanites, and there's stuff about different kings and queens of both nations and different lands or countries or whatever you want to call it that they found and have their little kingdoms in there, and then they have different wars and different sides win on those, and then of course, you had Lamanites one time had a big revival and their skin got white and delights them and stuff, but there's a lot of story in there that's probably not quite as exciting, but the beginning and the end is probably the best way to describe the story.
So I know we want to talk a little bit about what we talked with the Mormons, but we still want to lay a little bit of background as to what do they believe. So Joseph Smith, didn't he have this vision like when he was a teenager and he was 14, and it's what's called his first vision. So what happened with that?
I mean, it's been a while since I've seen a documentary, but I think there might have been several revisions of what the vision was. One of them might have just been he saw God the Father, could have been Jesus, but then there's another version where both of them appear to him, and the Father and the Son, and they both are depicted of looking almost exactly the same with the same long white beard. But so I can't dogmatically say what the vision was, because maybe different Mormons have different ones they hold on to. But
yeah, the various accounts of it, and the one, at least from the video that the church produced that I watched recently, the version of it, Joseph Smith recounts that he saw two personages. That's how he described it. And so in this vision, what happened, basically, didn't Joseph Smith ask, well, if you have a vision of God, you want to ask about what is the truth here? Kind of like Paul saying, Lord, what would you have me to do? But Joseph Smith, now that I'm talking to God himself and Jesus Christ, what church should I join, basically? Because he had some questions and he had talked to a minister, although Joseph Smith was not really a church-going person much. He wanted to ask God, what church should I go to? And basically he was told, well, all of the denominations are false. They're corrupted and their creeds are corrupted. And so he realized that, okay, I guess you're going to restore the true church through me now. But Joseph Smith was someone who was known at the time for doing treasure hunting and using seer stones to find treasure, and people thought that he was good at that. At least that's how he projected himself to other people. And that kind of thing was common at this time in the 19th century. There were a lot of people who claimed divinations, claimed to be treasure seekers, claimed to be able to find things with seer stones. And so Joseph Smith kind of seemed to take this seer stone to use to restore the church. So as you said, the angel Moroni in a later encounter there gets him to the brass plates or shows him where they're at. And I guess when he first finds it, he's not allowed to retrieve them. Like I think it's several years later. Each year, Moroni would show him to the plates, but not allow him to grab them until, several years later, whereas now he had finally had the task to take them and to translate them, and he put a curtain to separate him from a scribe. I think one of the scribes was a man by the name of Oliver Cowdery, who would become one of his companions, one of his disciples for a while, one of his converts, but he was a scribe at some time. Other times it might have been his wife, Emma, but he'd always have a curtain to separate himself, and I think the reason might be, don't defile things, don't disturb me, I'm just going to dictate to you and you write it down. Eyewitness reports had him doing it like by looking at the seer stone in his top hat.
Yeah, and it's funny how with Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon, there isn't even a unified story of what he used to do so. Like you mentioned, the seer stone in his hat, and I think I've seen a painting where it shows him bending over and having his face implanted in his hat. He has the seer stone inside his hat, and he's like putting his face into his hat to block out any light so that the seer stone can show the words that are coming in from the brass plates. Like, I don't know how that worked. So
he must have glowed
inside. He has the brass hat plate somewhere near him, but he has his face in his hat the whole time. And then I've seen another version of where he has something called the Urim and Thummim, and they're like lenses on a pair of spectacles that he's wearing and translating the plates. And I think I've even seen a painting of that. So I don't know which one is more credible.
Yeah, because I've seen that where it's like the Urim and Thummim are stones. They're called stones, but I guess they're stones ground into lenses and spectacles there, yeah. And then didn't he also have a plate of armor? Was it supposed to be
I think was it somehow the what is it called, the ephod or ephod, and it was like attached to the Urim and Thummim spectacles with some kind of cord.
And didn't he also have the sword of Laban, as he claimed? The one that Nephi used to kill Laban according to God's command. You have to kill Laban to get the plates. And Nephi first wondered if that was moral to do, but then God told him, yes, do it because it's necessary.
Oh, yeah. When it's talking about the seer stone and that Joseph Smith was considered a seer, an interesting thing, it's in the Book of Mormon and Mosiah chapter 8, and I can read from like a couple verses from verse 14. It says, "And behold, the king of the people who are in the land of Zarahemla is the man that is commanded to do these things, and who has this high gift from God. And the king said that a seer is greater than a prophet. And Ammon said that a seer is a revelator and a prophet also, and a gift which is greater can no man have, except he should possess the power of God, which no man can. Yet a man may have great power given to him from God, but a seer can know of things which are past, and also of things which are to come. And by them shall all things be revealed, or rather, shall secret things be made manifest. And hidden things shall come to light, and things which are not known shall be made known by them, and also things shall be made known by them which otherwise could not be known." It kind of sounds like he's trying to describe Joseph Smith in there, like as the seer, like maybe a prophet in that context is trying to say, well, they both have something from God, but a prophet just gets a message from God and prophesies possibly the future, but the seer, not only does he have that, but he also has these skills from God where he can understand more things like past, present, future, and be able to interpret things, like conveniently translate the Book of Mormon into English. That's why the seer is greater than a prophet, because he just has more of these divine skills from God than just the ability to prophesy something.
Truthspresso is like caffeine for the mind each week to take on the world's craziness. So why not do that with some actual caffeine, like in an actual cup? That's why Truthspresso is partnering with 7 Weeks Coffee. Unlike all the big woke coffee companies, 7 Weeks Coffee doesn't use their profits to fund abortions or clown world woke causes. 7 Weeks Coffee is a Christian-owned company that has donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to pro-life organizations. In fact, the name 7 Weeks Coffee comes from the fact that a 7-week-old baby in the womb is about the size of a coffee bean. 10% of every sale and upwards of 50% of their profits go towards saving babies. 7 Weeks Coffee has donated to over 850 pro-life organizations. But what about their coffee? Is it good? 7 Weeks Coffee is mold and toxin-free, ultra-low acid, and direct trade sourced from farmers they personally know. Get it ground or whole bean. Try their Hope Blend Medium Roast or their Faith Blend Dark Roast. Sip in serenity and drink with dignity, knowing that you're helping save lives with every purchase. So why not wake up with a podcast and a coffee company that share your values? Check out 7 Weeks Coffee for both delicious and virtuous coffee. If you follow my link at truthhub.org/coffee, for every succulent blend you purchase, a portion of the proceeds will go to Castle Rock Women's Health, a life-affirming clinic that offers comprehensive women's health care and saves babies. Check out 7 Weeks Coffee today and save lives by going to truthhub.org/coffee. That's truthhub.org/coffee. So, Joseph Smith claimed to restore the church and that the truth of the gospel was lost. One of the things that he claimed to restore in a later encounter with an angel, well, actually he encountered, it's kind of like his own version of the Transfiguration, because he had John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John all show up. And I think according to the video that they produced, Oliver Cowdery was there with him, where they revealed to him that the priesthood was restored and given to Joseph Smith, and that this priesthood was necessary to carry out the ordinances of the church, the commands of the gospel, which include baptism. So we mentioned earlier when Jesus allegedly appeared to the Nephites in Mesoamerica after his resurrection, according to the Book of Mormon in AD 34, after Jesus resurrected and ascended to heaven, then he goes to visit the other Israelites that are across the pond there, and he gives them the gospel, and he gives them the proper way to do communion and the proper way to do baptism, because that was important to Joseph Smith during his life. That was one of those controversies, like, so what's the true church and what's the proper way to do baptism? And according to Joseph Smith, as he was given the priesthood, somehow you have to have the priesthood in order to do a proper baptism. So a baptism doesn't count unless someone who holds the priesthood performs it on someone else. And so Joseph Smith resurrected the priesthood. John the Baptist gave him the keys to the priesthood. And so there are 2 priesthoods in Mormonism. There's the priesthood of Aaron, and then there's the priesthood of Melchizedek. And so the priesthood of Aaron is kind of inferior to the priesthood of Melchizedek. So it's kind of like, okay, the priesthood of Aaron could do some things like baptize someone, but he can't officiate the marriage ceremonies that Mormons need to attain the highest level of glory. So we'll get to that later, maybe in another episode, the celestial marriage. So someone after the priesthood of Aaron could baptize someone and lay hands at someone, but only someone from the Melchizedek, the superior, the ultimate priesthood, the priesthood of Jesus Christ, can actually perform a celestial marriage that allows someone the highest level of exaltation or salvation in a way. So what do Mormons believe about Jesus Christ? Because then that will get into kind of our brief conversation with Mormons that we had not long before starting recording this episode. John, do you have any thoughts of like what exactly do they believe about God and Jesus, and kind of in a nutshell?
When they were first talking to us, they sounded very Christian in how they described God the Father and Jesus, but then later on they're clarifying that they believe that Jesus and the Father are both God, but they're separate beings. So they don't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. If they consider the Holy Spirit also God or a God, then it would seem more like tritheism, at least for the planet Earth. But they're more like polytheists in that since the bishop actually claimed that Jesus as a God became a man so that man can become, and just kind of muttered God and pointed up.
And it seemed a little bit like he was hesitant because he knew that we're Christians of some form. He probably didn't know exactly the details of that, but he knew that, okay, they're trying to pitch their church to us, but try to sound as much like us as he could until the answers that they give to some of our questions would reveal some of the distinctives there. But yeah, we said that man can become God.
Yeah, when you think of the way that's worded, it actually sounds kind of cool in a sense to say God became man so that man can become God. I mean, just on a surface level, that just sounds kind of poetic in a sense, like he comes down to become like us so that we can become like him, and which does sound Christian, except for the idea of us becoming God. That doesn't sound Christian, but they use the word God becoming man so that man can become God sounds interesting, I would say.
I mean, there are some early church fathers that say things like that, Athanasius and especially some of the Eastern fathers, but they didn't mean the same thing that Mormons believe, because they believe that what they call Heavenly Father, that God, his name is Elohim, and then he was once a man who followed the law of eternal progression, the gospel as they understand it, to be resurrected and ultimately to achieve the highest level of glory, which then allows him to become a God as he's resurrected. Which to become a god is to have a resurrected human body and to be able to procreate and have children. And so we're literally children of God in their beliefs that God has a wife or wives, and he has children through them. Now they're spirit children, and these spirit children eventually inhabit bodies on earth. There's so much we could get into there, but ultimately they don't believe that Jesus is God with the Father in the way Orthodox Christianity teaches. It's separate beings. You said tritheism, but ultimately polytheism, because they believe that the God of this world was once a man who had a God, and that God was once a man, and so on. There's like an infinite regress, basically, and so there's a huge difference, and so that's something that we want to talk with our Mormon guests about. And so as we were talking with them, we let them give a presentation of their belief system, kind of like let them pitch their concept of the gospel. And I mean, I noticed that they weren't really getting into like substitutionary atonement that much. It was more like Jesus, the one who started their church and stuff, and ideas of following him, getting to know him, obeying him, enduring to the end, and good works and stuff. So I wanted to prod them with questions about, well, who is Jesus? And you gave the example of if the one elder murdered someone and then you wanted to take his place and you went to prison for that, and you said you're paying for one person's sin, and then you asked, like, how does Jesus pay for the sins of many? And you referenced a certain verse, like, do you remember? Yeah, Isaiah 53:11, to talk about how my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. And So instead of taking a dagger and trying to go to the jugular of Mormonism like some people might be tempted to do, I wanted to start off with very basic but deep questions to get them thinking about salvation, and ultimately then to think about, well, who is Jesus and why is he the Savior and how does that work? And so, I asked them about how does the atonement work and how is Jesus able to bear the sins of many people? And they thought that was a good question, and they admitted they don't fully understand that. And I said, well, no one really could fully understand that, but I was interested in what kind of answer they might have. And then to go from there to asking, well, who is Jesus and why is he uniquely qualified to do that? And so then to get them thinking and explaining who Jesus is, because as I point out to them, you emphasize that you're the church of Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is the most important person to understand. He started your church. So, who is he? And
I really appreciate how the bishop actually talked about how God is... He sounds like he's trying to say outside of time, or at least in some kind of existence where past, present, and future are kind of the now for him. But he actually said that Jesus on the cross paid for your past, present, and future sins, which I wasn't even expecting him to say that, because I know they believe that you have to do good works to keep or maintain your salvation. One of the elders claimed that if you lose your faith, you're going to struggle and you got to kind of do stuff or maybe gain it back. So when he said past, present, future sins, then I immediately asked him about, is unbelief considered a sin? And he thought that was a really good question. And then I was trying to ask him, like, if Jesus pays for your sin and he pays for your unbelief so that you will believe, how can you lose your faith? It didn't seem like he gave a clear answer to that, but he was impressed by the question.
I asked him about who Jesus is and why he's uniquely qualified to be able to pay for our sins. And I know that obviously when Mormons, at least modern day Mormons, talk with people who they know ahead of time are some form of Christian and they're trying to proselytize them, they know some of the language that the Christians understand, and so they want to relate to that. But it was interesting. One of the elders said that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. So I was kind of taken aback by that. Like, okay, I don't remember how that works in their theology. So I was asking him to explain that. But the bishop at one point mentioned that he did distinguish Jesus from he called Jesus and the Father both God, but he did say they were separate beings.
They shared in the same goodness.
Yeah. So then I said, so you mean like it's a kind of an economic divinity, because I'm aware okay, they want to be able to say that they're both God, but it's kind of like they're both divine beings in this kind of family of godhood. So I know they're trying to be able to sound like the way we would think of things in a way to establish rapport there. But they did say they're different beings. And the bishop said that God has a body of just like we are, he has arms and legs and limbs and stuff. So when God makes a male and female, us, we reflect the way God is in his body and stuff. So it's like, okay, at least they weren't shy about saying that and knowing that most Christians are not going to relate to that in their theology.
Yeah, and then since they mention that the Father and the Son are separate beings and they're both God, that reminded me of when I read through the Book of Mormon, I think in 2017, there was a passage that I remembered and I had to look it up, but it's in Alma chapter 11 and verses 38 and 39, and that says, Now Zezrom saith again unto him, Is the Son of God the very eternal Father? And Amulek said unto him, Yea, he is the very eternal Father of heaven and of earth, and all things which in them are. He is the beginning and the end, the first and the last. And I was surprised that they actually mentioned the term modalism and that most Christians believe it would be heresy, because I thought I'd have to bring up that term and explain what it meant. So I'm glad they mentioned it, and I told them I'd been wondering what that meant, and told them that I was assuming that it was trying to teach modalism and in that passage, and they said, no, of course not. But at least at the moment, I would assume that Joseph Smith believed in modalism when he wrote the Book of Mormon. Of course, maybe these Mormons can explain this and convince me that he didn't, or of course they don't believe he wrote the book that he just translated, but explain that this isn't teaching modalism, because at the moment I'm still convinced that it was teaching modalism.
Yeah, so it's interesting that the Mormons are polytheists, but we didn't really get into that, or at least with the questions that we asked them, we didn't yet ask them about that. You know, they hinted at that, but we didn't really ask them, like, are you guys polytheists, or does your church teach that there's more than one God? Now, I was going to start to get into that question about, does Scripture teach that there's only one true God? And then ask them questions about some of those verses, because that's really one of the foundations of the Christian faith. They did call themselves Christians, as I expected them to do. But yeah, we believe the Bible clearly teaches that there is one true God, and some of the verses that I hope to ask them in the next time we get to talk to them would be Isaiah 43:10, that says, "Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me." And that's one of the verses, and we have several verses that talk about that, but you could find quite a few verses in the Bible that make it plain that there's only one true God, and then verses that talk about how God is eternal. Now, what's interesting is that I think the bishop said something that sounded like they believe that God is eternal. I mean, he mentioned the eternal now, which I didn't think Mormons believe that kind of thing, but Psalm 90 verse 2, it says, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hadst formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting thou art God." So that would be another verse I'd like to bring up the next time we get to talk to them, to wonder if you believe that God was once a man and became God, then what does this mean for God being God from everlasting to everlasting? Now, they would believe that in some form God always existed. Now, not as God, not even as like a person, but as an intelligence. But they might explain it that way, but he's God everlastingly.
That reminds me of some clip I remember listening to years ago with Pastor Jeff Durbin was out talking to Mormons at, was it the Mesa Easter pageant outside? And he was talking to some Mormon guy and asking him about God being God from eternity, and how can we become gods if God has been God for all of eternity? And the Mormon was claiming that when you become a god, you enter into some kind of state or dimension of timelessness where past, present, and future are no longer even a thing. So you can enter into that state and then claim that you've always been God from eternity to eternity. Of course, he didn't explain how that works, but he was just claiming that as an answer to that question.
Interesting, so that's another thing that we'll see if they have a similar explanation there. And so maybe they're coming up with ideas to answer some of the verses that they've been brought up before and had to argue with. But yeah, we'll have to see what they have to say. And I said before, wanted to bring up these verses, but they realized that it was getting late and they had to be somewhere or go back home or something. It was like, we better get going. And at first I felt disappointed, like, okay, how much ground did we break here? How much ground did we cover? I mean, we talked about kind of a gospel in a sense and asked about substitutionary atonement and got to a question of who Jesus is, but not to our explanation of it yet. And then I wanted to get into questions about one true God, but that's when they had to leave. So yeah, there was no conversion going on in this first visit here. And So we did talk about they actually were open to visiting other churches. And so I invited them to go to the church of which I'm a member and maybe even to see the Christmas program that our church is going to put on. And so that would be pretty cool. And we'll have to pray that they actually go. I'm going to contact them and give them the information. And maybe I'll have some Mormon guests with me at the church and pray that they'll hear a clear presentation of the gospel with that.
I remember when near the beginning of the conversation where one of the elders said what distinguishes us from basically other Christian denominations is that they believe in continuing prophets.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't mention Joseph Smith, but he said that. And of course, in your notes, this is a question you'd still like to ask them about Hebrews 1 and 2.
Yeah, so surely you want to bring that up in another visit with them.
Yeah, and just in case you don't know it, it says, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. So it talks about the prophets in the past, but the last days he spoke to us by his Son. According to the passage, it doesn't seem like it gives room for another prophet after the Son.
Yeah, and then basically there's an apologetic throughout the book of Hebrews there that kind of emphasizes that point, because it's like Jesus is better than Moses, Jesus is better than Abraham, Jesus is better than everyone else, he's better than the angels. He brought in the new covenant and phases out the old covenant. There's no going back to the old covenant, and he's a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And so that'll be interesting to bring that up and to bring up other verses in Hebrews, especially to talk about the priesthood, as it pertains to the fact that Jesus himself, as God has spoken through his Son in the last days, it's the final revelation of God to us, not through the prophets anymore, but through Jesus Christ as prophet, priest, and king, the final one, the unique Son of God. And then, so there's no room in the Bible for prophets after Jesus. Now, I mean, there were apostles who had the gift of prophecy, but there's no office of prophet after Jesus. And so that'll be an interesting topic as we get into later visits with them. One true God, who is Jesus, as being one in being with the Father, but distinct in person, and why this is necessary for the gospel, and all kind of goodness like that.
Especially the law of eternal progression. That'll be a fun topic to talk to them about.
There's lots to talk with about Mormons because there's lots that we disagree with. Just trying to comb through all the lingo that they give that relates to evangelical Christianity. But when we really dive into it, there's a whole lot of difference there. We get to gods and planets and angels and law of eternal progression and resurrection, baptism for the dead. Like, there's so much stuff we can get into, and which we will hope to be able to do as we get to know and befriend these Mormons more, and maybe having them visit our church and having other meetings with them. And so that's something that we'd like our listeners to pray about, that these Mormons will be able to come to know the true Jesus Christ and not the one that Joseph Smith proclaimed.
Yeah, and I joked to you before the podcast about if there could be a time we might actually have them in an episode on the podcast, but don't hold your breath for that. You never know if they'd be willing to do that, but it is just a fun idea to think about if they were willing. Like, they find out you have a podcast and you're like, hey, would you like to be a guest on there? And
I'd be open to that. I mean, I don't think it would happen without a few more visits with them, but I'd like to do more visits, and then maybe if they don't become true Christians after several visits, then maybe that would be something we can arrange. Well, thank you, John, for being a special guest here on Truthspresso and for accompanying me to meet with these Mormons and to ask them questions, and for the knowledge that you bring, having read through all of the Mormon scriptures, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price. And I hope that you'll be able to join with me again in more conversations with these Mormons. And thanks once again for being here on Truthspresso.
Thanks for having me, and we'll see you talk more discussions, and maybe I'll be on some more episodes afterwards discussing what we talked about.
Yes, indeed. And so I hope that you all have enjoyed this episode of Truthspresso about Mormonism and our actual dialogue with some Mormons. And stay tuned for more episodes of Truthspresso. We'll be sure to talk about more of what Mormons believe, and hopefully also to talk about more of conversations with these Mormons. And so God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truthspresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.